So what we know as communion was the way they celebrated the Passover. It was a sort of an introduction to what would happen over the next several days in the Jewish community during Passover. And Jesus wanted to spend some intimate time with his disciples. He had been telling them for the past 3 years that he was going to be the sacrifice. They knew that he was the Messiah, but they did not understand what that meant. They didn't know that he was going to make himself available to die for the sins of mankind. This whole idea of the Passover lamb was about to come to a distinct halt. After this sacrifice, there would be no need for any other, for he died for all mankind and for all time. One time, the death of the Son of God was to eradicate sin in a way where we would not have to be beholden to sin any longer. That was Jesus' sacrifice. And he wanted to have the last intimate session with his disciples. So he told them to go find this place. And I can recall having gone to Jerusalem. And it's funny how, and some of you may have taken this trek now. It's not safe to do now today. But in fact, I can remember when I went, I thought it was going to be the last time anyone was going to be able to go, because we had actually had to pause our trip and do it later. But the unrest in the region is always a call for interruption. But when I went and we were touring these different places, they took us to the place where they said was the Last Supper. I didn't believe it. I said, this can't be the place. And now, there's no way to know. I mean, they tell you what it's all for entertainment. It's the tour. But several places we went, and I was not convinced that this was the place. But there's one place I'm convinced of was the place, and I'll tell you about that maybe later or some other time. But the beauty of this room, where they claimed is where the Last Supper was, the acoustics were amazing. I don't know what it was about it, but when we sang about what Jesus did that night, it created community. We all had the same sense of the purpose of that communion. And with the acoustics, it was a beautiful experience. Even though I didn't think that was the place where it happened, still had the experience of being reminded of what Jesus did wherever it took place. Another place I went, and this is a little side, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. We went to what they call the Wailing Wall. And if you've been there, you know that it's the wall, it's made of stone, much like this, but larger stone. And the cement in between, after so many thousands of years, has deteriorated. And what they do is they invite you to pray at the Wailing Wall. Now, I had an issue with that because it did not go with my theological sensibilities at the time. Jesus or God was not there anymore. This wall, all that's left of the temple, it signified the presence of God for all of those years. But after the death of Jesus, for me, it had no value save historical value. And so you may have seen the men standing at the Wailing Wall. And some people think that they are banging their heads on the wall. That's not what's happening. They are nodding to the wall as they pray. And they're giving homage to this wall. And what they do for the tourists is they give you a little piece of paper. And they ask you to write your prayer on that wall and stick it in between the cracks in the wall. Now, if you know me, and based on what I've been telling you already, I found no value in that. But as I struggled with God and said, all right, I'll do it. And I wrote a little prayer on the wall, on the piece of paper. And I slipped my piece of paper in between the cracks of that wall that surrounded what used to be the temple. And I began to pray to God. And I said, Lord, I know that this wall is just a symbol of what has happened, what you have done. And the Lord began to speak back to me. And then I realized that time and space does not prevent God's presence. And I had a meaningful moment with my Lord at that wall, but understanding that the wall only represents what used to be, but what God represents is what always will be. And I'm thankful for that experience. But in this upper room where Jesus took his disciples, he pulled them together for this ceremony. And he mentioned to them that one of you will betray me. Now, what kind of announcement is that? What kind of announcement? Can you imagine what went through the minds of the disciples as Jesus said poignantly, one of you will betray me? He didn't point any fingers. He didn't give any hints as to who it might be until they asked the question. Now, how would you feel if I made an announcement about a general announcement that somebody in here did XYZ or will do XYZ? We're going to look around. Now, we know it's not kind to do. Not kind to do. Don't look at anyone, but we're going to want to look. I wonder who did that. And Ellen White talks about how the question came across the disciples' minds, who among us would betray Jesus? They began to search their hearts. How could I betray him? Maybe it's me. Lord, is it I? What have I done? Whatever I may have done was not intentional. And so, Lord, please identify it. If it's me, let me know so that I can stop this madness. And so around the room, to a man, 11 asked the question, Lord, is it I? And as each person asked the question, is it I? The attention was turned on that person. And we're told that as looking on their faces, you see, our faces can tell a story. When each person said, is it I? Every disciple looked upon each other's face to see what kind of sincerity came out from the question, is it I? 11 asked the question. And then after the 11th person asked the question, everybody's eyes turned to Judas. Judas had no choice but to ask the question, is it I? He asked a question to which he already knew the answer. And many of us already know our answer when we fall from grace of God. But the grace is always available. But we're told in the spirit of prophecy that when Jesus said to him, "What thou doest, do quickly," Judas stood up and left. And Ellen White says it was that moment, his decision to go through with his plan, where he cut himself off from the grace of God. You see, Judas really, he had a plan, and he believed he knew better than God, because he saw the power of Jesus firsthand, and he thought, wow, if we just did it this way, there'd be so many benefits. He didn't realize that Jesus was the sacrifice. He knew he was the Messiah. And he thought, if people just knew it, what would the benefits be? And he started calculating the finances that would come as a result of the world knowing that he was the Messiah. She calls it avarice. His love for gain and money. That was his motive for betraying Jesus. Insomuch that even before the night, he went to the leaders and said, "What will you give me if I give you Jesus?" And the prophet tells us exactly how many pieces of gold Jesus would be betrayed for. What thou doest, do quickly. The question that's still in my mind is, did that convince the other disciples that Judas was about to do something to betray Jesus? They must have, but they didn't stop him. Judas wanted fame and fortune and money. He had spent intimate time with Jesus, but there was something he wanted, and he thought it went along with the plan of God. But he discovered it did not. I did some sales one summer in between, between college courses. And in that college course, during those sales meetings we used to have, I was introduced to a sales motivational speaker by the name of Zig Ziglar. You may have heard of him. Zig Ziglar used to say this thing. He said, "You can have anything you want in life if you just help enough other people get what they want." And as I look at that, it's true for sales, but it's not true for the gospel. Jesus had a plan for the salvation of the universe. The disciples had their own things they wanted as a result of being associated with Jesus. And so if we were to apply Zig Ziglar's mantra, Jesus could not do that and fulfill his purpose. The sons of thunder wanted to sit at his right hand and his left, but he could not help them do that and fulfill the plan of the gospel. Judas wanted fame and fortune and even money thought for a good purpose, But Jesus couldn't help him get what he wanted. That mantra does not apply in the gospel. What applies is Jesus' purpose for his church. And he wants us to remember him for every facet of our life. As often as you do this, do it in remembrance of me, in remembrance of the sacrifice I've made, in remembrance of the miracles that I performed so that you could recognize that I am who I say I am, the Son of God, who hours later died for all mankind. And so, as Jesus had this last intimate moment with the whole group, he wants to have intimate moments with us so that we can become more aware of who he is and so that we may become more like him. And so, as we prepare to participate in this communion service, I'm asking you to think on who Jesus is for you and thank him for his sacrifice so that we may one day see him as he is and live eternity with him.